Yeah, so I'm an app modernization specialist for Google Cloud. So I've been with Google over 5 years, and I work with customers on implementation of their API programs, of Anthos, of their multi-cloud strategy, and based out of Detroit, Michigan. So happy to be here.
It does look like we are recording. That's good. Okay, so let's cover the agenda. So we are going to first cover just a little bit of background of Cloud Foundry. Then we're going to go into actually running Cloud Foundry apps on GCP and Kubernetes with KF. David's going to give us an amazing demo that will actually be probably most of the session today. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion and time for audience questions as well. So you'll be able to ask the questions. You can use a chat or you can speak up towards the end. All right, so let's talk about what makes Cloud Foundry popular. It really comes down to the same goal that both application developers and the business have had for a long time, which is to speed your application delivery. Cloud Foundry solved this with a very opinionated approach, make it simple for application developers to deploy their apps, and allow admins and operators to secure and configure the platform from a single location. A lot of the complexities get hidden, and developers are able to concentrate on building features that gain the business competitive advantage. That all sounds great, but there are some downsides. Having an opinionated platform means that there will be guardrails and limitations that might exist. This means that you likely won't be able to run all of your applications on Cloud Foundry, and therefore you'll have multiple platforms that you're managing. It also, of course, isn't without its costs. For commercial offerings, the licensing can be quite costly, and Cloud Foundry may not be conducive to a microservices architecture. Even Cloud Foundry is moving towards Kubernetes as a backend for container management to replace Bosh. To illustrate this point a bit, I want to talk about a large enterprise customer that I work with that has a large and widespread development environment spread across many different business units with varying needs. They also have a large Pivotal Cloud Foundry installation that works for many of their applications and developers. In these cases, they actually love that there are guardrails in place because it allows developers with a variety of skills to develop applications quickly. However, they have another set of developers and applications that need considerably more flexibility. For this group of developers, they've standardized on Kubernetes as the platform. This gives the developers the flexibility they need while allowing the operators to allowing the operators to have some control of the platform. This, of course, also now means they need to operate two platforms. So let's talk a little bit about how you can use KF to run your Cloud Foundry applications on Kubernetes. First of all, KF is built natively on Kubernetes. It uses controllers and custom resource definitions, or CRDs. A developer uses the KF CLI to interact with KF CRDs, which then orchestrate other Kubernetes primitives, including deployments, Anthos service mesh for routing, and Tecton for builds. Now, don't worry too much if we're going relatively fast through this, but David's actually going to show some of these things, so I think it'll become a little more clear if you're not familiar with some of these terms. An operator installs, updates, and configures, and generally operates KF using kubectl and similar native Kubernetes commands. All of this can run on GKE and Anthos clusters, which provides you with very flexible deployment options. You can deploy to Google Cloud, of course, but really only if you want the best experience. Otherwise, you can deploy to other cloud providers or even on-prem. I'm just kidding there, folks. But aside from deployment options, Anthos is a suite of tools to help you modernize and manage your platforms. You can use Anthos config management to provide a declarative approach for managing your clusters and applications. Anthos Service Mesh can secure your workloads and provide valuable insight into call patterns, availability, transaction rates, and more. Anthos is a suite of tools that can be used together to modernize your application development. To reiterate, at a high level, this all comes down to replacing the functionality of CF and Bosh with KF and Kubernetes. In my experience, most enterprises that are using Cloud Foundry have, or at least starting to use, Kubernetes. Using KF on Anthos allows the admins and operators to manage a single platform, in this case Kubernetes, while allowing developers to maintain a similar workflow that they're familiar with from CF. You're probably saying by now, I get it. You can move to Kubernetes. But let's look a little deeper into what you get with Anthos and GKE as a platform. First of all, you get flexibility. The stack is open standards-based, built on projects like Kubernetes and Istio. Next, you get declarative, auditable configuration and automation to make certain that your config is where you want it and your applications are easy to deploy. Of course, this is all for nothing if it isn't built on a layer of security, controlling who has access to what and ensuring visibility into the state of security on your platform. Now, KF won't be at 100% parity with CF, but close enough to allow you to move and improve and avoid paying Cloud Foundry costs. As you can see, it will look very familiar to existing CF developers. You can find the full list of commands in the KF documentation, along with a comparison of the features as well. So let's briefly look at some of the benefits of KF through the lens of various personas. As the admin, I want to standardize things as much as possible, reduce support, run in the locations that the business requires, and take advantage of a growing and maturing ecosystem. Minimizing costs would be great as well. KF is free to use, though of course you still need to pay for the underlying platform like Anthos. This means that you also get to take advantage of the rich toolset provided by Anthos to automate your infrastructure configuration and secure your platform. Since Kubernetes likely already exists in your enterprise ecosystem, like we talked about, you can reuse much of what's already in place and don't need a bunch of new tooling and process. If I'm an operator, I want the tools I need to make sure that the platform is reliable and scalable. With KF, I can take advantage of site reliability engineering, or SRE tooling, from the folks that wrote the book, and use cloud monitoring and alerting to manage my service level objective and error budgets. I want great visibility to know what is running and who is consuming which resources. Again, cloud monitoring allows you to create dashboards to manage all of your KF workloads. I can also take advantage of managed backing services like Cloud SQL, so I no longer need to operate these myself. Finally, as an app developer, just leave me alone already and let me write my code. With KF, you can maintain the flow of the developer, minimize changes to the code, and improve logging and metrics along the way. Ideally, your developers will be asking, what migration? Before we get to the demo, I just want to briefly talk about the main components that make the base for KF. First of all, you need a Kubernetes cluster, of course, which is provided by GKE or Anthos clusters. From there, you will install the components, the CRDs that we talked about, that make up the KF CLI. The KF CLI, in turn, makes use of Tekton to handle KF build. Tekton can handle both build pack and Docker file builds. To handle routing, KF uses Anthos Service Mesh, which is Google Cloud's managed Istio offering. Finally, there's native integration into the Google Cloud monitoring and logging console. This allows you to provide monitoring at both the app level as well as for the lower level infrastructure resources such as pods, nodes, etc. With that, I will waste no more time barking at you, and I'm going to turn it over to David for the demo.
All right, thanks, Greg. Let me share my screen. All right, thanks for that. So I want to show the demo. A couple things I want to highlight around the KF tool. The first thing is I'm going to show how to push a new application to KF. So I have a sample app that I'll push to it and show how that's deployed and used throughout Kubernetes. The second thing is I'm going to migrate an existing app that's currently running in Cloud Foundry and go through the steps of what it means to migrate that existing app to Kubernetes using the KF tool. Third thing is I'm going to show some operational commands on how you can use a KF tool to manage the app, to auto scale it, and do a few other things with it. The fourth thing is I'm going to go just a little more in detail about the custom resources that were deployed and how those match up with the KF tool. And then the last thing is I'm going to show some monitoring and metrics in the GCP UI on how operators can manage the application once it's deployed. So to get started, there is a KF Quick Start guide. So if you're looking to do this in your own environment, this is the best place to start. And as Greg mentioned, it's going to walk you through installing a cluster, installing the KF components in the cluster. That's also going to install the KF CLI. And this is what my cluster looks like right now, which we'll get into. So I've already done all this. So I'm going to open this up and I have everything connected. So first thing I'm going to do is just show you the KF tool. So the KF tool has a lot of commands. This is just to help. And you notice if you're familiar with the CF tool, it matches up with all of these different commands that you can do. In Cloud Foundry, there's a concept called organizations and spaces. So we're going to show you the spaces. So I can use the KF spaces command. And this will show my existing spaces that I have right now. So the one that I want to work with right now is this one. So let me just make sure I'm using this space, and we are. So the first thing I want to do is just deploy a sample app to Kubernetes using KF. There is a Cloud Foundry sample out on GitHub, and this is the test app. So if you're looking to do this yourself, you can go to this app. This is a very basic web app, but it just serves the purpose of showing how this KF tool could work. So I've already cloned this app. So I'm going to go into my folder. And I'm going to do this manifest. So this has a manifest file. This is the deployment file that the KF is going to use when I deploy the application. It just has the name, some memory instances, and the routing information. So it's very straightforward to do this. All I would do is do a KF push. And this is very similar to CF, where I would do a CF push. But in this case, I'm just doing a KF push. It takes about 4 or 5 minutes to run, so I'm not going to run it now, but I've already previously run it. So I'm going to show what the results are. And by doing KF apps, it'll list all of the apps that are deployed in my space. Currently have test app, and so I'm going to take this URL and just put it up in the browser real quick so you can see that it works. So it's very straightforward, but this gives you an idea. If you have an existing app that's in code in a repo, then you can use this tool to deploy it fairly easy. Just a few other things I want to point out. So if I have my cluster and I go to Kubernetes, do a get namespace, you'll see several namespaces that are there. You'll see a KF namespace and this gateway namespace. That's used for the KF components that are installed in the cluster. But if you notice that when I did the KF spaces, there's a matching namespace in Kubernetes. So if I do a kubectl get pods, and in this namespace, you'll see my app that's running as a pod inside this namespace. And it matches what I do with KF apps. So a lot of these things, you'll see that the KF commands match up with something that you can do in Kubernetes. So Kubernetes does have a learning curve, and sometimes it takes a little bit to get used to how it works. But if you're used to how the KF commands work, you can do the KF commands, do what you need to do in Kubernetes, and then learn the Kubernetes commands over time. Another thing I'll show real quick, if I do a logs, and where's my pod at? Here it is. I'll see the logs of my application. Oops. But I can also do the same thing with KF logs. So I can do test app and it'll do the same thing. So it just gives you an idea of some of the commands and things that I can use to get around. The next thing I want to show is how do I take an existing app that's running in Cloud Foundry and how can I easily migrate that to Kubernetes? So I have an app that's running. I have an instance of Cloud Foundry. I have a list of my spaces, a list of, this is my demo org. I'm going to go into my space here. I have 2 apps that are running, the test app and the Spring Music app. And I'll just pull up this real quick to show this app. Now, this app is available also on GitHub under Cloud Foundry samples, Spring Music. It's a Spring Boot web application that has an in-memory database. You can also connect it to other databases. So it's a good way just to highlight this functionality. So I'm going to go through the steps. I'm going to talk about the steps that are involved to do the migration, and then I'll get into showing how that works. So the first thing we do is there's a command in KF that lets us assess the current environment in Cloud Foundry. And it'll go out and it'll inspect the environment and pull down all the information that's there, like all the apps that are running, service brokers, domains, all those things, and create an Excel spreadsheet of all that information. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. The next thing is I have a command that's going to create what's called a migration plan. It's going to go out to that specific app that's running get all that runtime information and store it in a YAML file. And then I can open up that YAML file and make corrections or make changes before I deploy the app. Once I've made my changes and have it, my settings to the new environment, then I can do a KF apply, and that'll take that and deploy it from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes. And the last thing is I'm going to show a couple of KF commands on how I can administer the application and engage in the environment using KF. All right, so let me pull this up. I actually have another space for this. I'm just going to switch my space here. Now I do have CF running as well, so I can do a CF command, and that just shows me that I'm connected to Cloud Foundry, and I can pull the information just like I would with KF, but I'm using CF. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create this report. Now this command KF migrate scan CF cluster, that's going to go out to the Cloud Foundry, get pretty much the lay of the land of what's out there, and then create a report on it. So I'll run this command. Runs pretty quickly, and it gets out a lot of information here. I ran this previously, so I have it up so we can take a look at it. A lot of detail here, which I won't go into all of these things, but a couple of things I want to point out. So any build packs that I have registered, those would be listed here. Domains that I may have, spaces, apps, services, routes. So there's a lot of information here. One thing I'll point out is under domains, if there's something that it gets flagged, like something may not migrate automatically for you, or something that may not work in the new environment, it'll also let you know. So in this case, I have an internal domain registered in Cloud Foundry, and that won't be able to be migrated automatically through this tool. I would have to recreate it in KF. So it highlights and says that this particular internal domain would be unsupported as far as the migration. So very useful tool. It gives you a lot of great information for you to get started on your migration. The next step is this KF migration plan that I mentioned. So let's run that real quick. What this will do, this is KF migrate plan. It's going to go out to this particular Cloud Foundry org that I have set up, the space and the app, and it's going to create this YAML file. So I'll run this. And it did find 2 issues. Let's take a look at what it found. Now, the YAML file has a lot of information about the current Cloud Foundry environment, what the name of the app is. It's a Spring Boot app, so it has the different arguments that are passed in when the app is started, all the different Java command line arguments, different other environment variables to set. Now, if it does find an issue, it's going to create an issue stanza in the YAML and highlight what that issue is. So if you do fix the issue, then you can remove that part of the YAML. So in this case, I already know it says app manifest must have a single process. So what that means is this instance must not be 0, and I'll just set it to 1. A few other things here. There is this internal domain issue that I mentioned that was in the spreadsheet. So I'm going to remove this issue because I don't need the internal domain when I deploy it. So I'm going to remove that. So there's several other settings here. It's really what does your new environment look like? What is the domain name? What are other things that you can set? So it's an opportunity to change these settings before you do the apply and do the migrate. And the last thing is to do this KF migrate apply. So this command is this KF migrate apply is going to take that YAML file and apply it and do the actual deployment. It's going to take what's out in Cloud Foundry and deploy it to Kubernetes using KF. The -v is verbose, so it'll pretty much show every line and every command that it's trying to do. This will take about 4 or 5 minutes. So I'm not going to run it now, but I am going to show what the results are. I do let me make sure I'm in the right spaces here. Switch to my music space. Oops. If I do KF apps, I'll be able to see the apps that are deployed. Now, in this case, I did do have it deployed. So let me just pull this up here and show that. So that gives you an idea. Same thing if I pull it up in Kubernetes. So I have KF apps that are shown here. And if I do a kubectl get pods in that demos music namespace that I had, it's going to show this pod that's running. That's my application. So that gives you an idea of what that migration process would look like. Many apps could be migrated like this. The other apps, there may be more pieces to it that you would need to migrate. May have other types of service brokers, databases, other things like that. I'll talk about that in a second. What I want to show next is just a couple commands that allow me to engage with the app, just like I would with CF, but I'll be using the KF tool and I'll be using Kubernetes behind the scenes. So one thing that a lot of administrators need to do is set auto scaling, and there's a certain way of doing it through Kubernetes. But KF, with CF, there's also a way of doing it. So by using a couple commands, I'm gonna set auto scaling. So in this case, I first have to enable auto scaling for my app. And the next thing is I'm going to create an auto scaling rule. Now there could be a lot to the rule. This is a pretty straightforward rule, but it basically increases the instance from 1 to 2. But you could add different thresholds depending on CPU usage, different things like that. So I'll create this auto scaling rule, and I'll actually do something that will trigger it. And if I do KF apps again, you'll see this now says instance 1, but now it's saying auto scaled from 1 to 2. So the ability to scale up to 2 is there, and it's actually in the process of it. I'll come back to it and show you what it looks like once it scales up. It'll take a few seconds. Next thing I want to cover real quick is the concept of service brokers. So along with deploying an app, there are 2 types of service brokers that Kubernetes supports. One is the managed services. So there are services that are built into the KF platform that you can leverage pretty much out of the box. And you can also add new ones and configure them through the framework. So if you see those, I can do a KF marketplace, and those will show the ones that are automatically deployed and configured in the platform. In this case, I have an NFS volume broker that I could leverage if I wanted to. The other type is called a user-provided service. And this is something like a SQL database or a file storage system or a pub sub or something like that. And it could be any GCP cloud service that I can configure as a service, a user-provided service. So to do that, I would use this command, which is kf cups. Cups means create user-provided service. And I'm just going to create this pretty straightforward database configuration. Now, once I've done that, I need to bind it to my app. So I have my KF services here. That shows you that it's been created. Now I want my Spring Music app to use this database. So I'm going to use this bind service, and that's going to bind that application to using that service. And so what this means is if I restart it, it would use this database instead of the in-memory one that I have configured now. So just wanted to point out a few of those things. There's some other things that can be done. There's like KF tasks. There's KF routes, things like that. So the KF command can be used to really administrate the system pretty nicely. Let me just go back to the auto scaling. If I go back to KF apps, see now that instances are 2. And if I pull up the pods in that Kubernetes namespace, you'll see that I have 2 pods that are running now. So I have a replica of 2. So it gives you an idea of how I can do things with KF and with Kubernetes at the same time. So it gives you the ability, if you're not comfortable with Kubernetes right away, to start engaging with the cluster using the KF commands, and then slowly learn the Kubernetes commands over time. So last thing I'll show a couple things about the custom resources that I want to get into the GCP UI and show a little bit about the cluster. So to see the types of custom resources that were deployed, I can use this command. And this will give me a list of the resources, these custom resources that were created. And you'll recognize some of them, like here's spaces, here's apps, here's routes. So these are the common things that I would use KF for, but this is how where it's defined as a custom resource. And just another example, if I do KF services, this will show my MyDB that I had configured, but I could also do the same thing with kubectl and get that same result. I want to show a couple things here. So in GKE, I have my cluster that I created that's running all of this. And if I go to Object Browser, and I'm going to find the KF Dev section. So if I expand this and go to spaces, you'll see the 2 spaces that I have configured. The apps will show the apps that I have configured, the routes, things like that. So especially as an administrator, this is a good way to find out all of the things that are deployed in the cluster if you don't know all the kubectl commands to do that. So the workloads tab will show all of the pods and certain things that I have running in the cluster. And I'm going to go to my Spring Music app that's running as a workload. And this just gives me a lot of information about this app. If you notice, I have a replica set to 2 because I auto scaled it earlier. Just a different information. I can view the logs as well. Now, if I click on operations, and I'm going to open this in a full screen, there's a tool in GCP called Cloud Monitoring. And by clicking on that button, it automatically opened the dashboard that's pre-built for GKE. So they have these out-of-the-box dashboards for GKE. And it filtered on my cluster, my namespace, and the Spring Music app that I have running. I'm going to click on auto refresh. So this just gives you an idea of all the information that you can find about the cluster, about the app that's running, about the node, the services. So it gives you a lot of information. So especially as a platform administrator or someone that's in the operations team, gives you a lot of detail about the app. And if something's wrong, it'll highlight it, or you can at least get a lot more information when you're looking at the service. Let me go back over to dashboard. So there's another thing that is pretty nice. So in GitHub, in the Cloud Foundry, or in the Cloud Foundry, the KF repo that we have out on GitHub, there is a dashboards folder here. And so we do have a dashboard specifically designed for KF apps, and there's a script to deploy it. So if you're using KF and you have the app deployed, definitely deploy this dashboard. So it'll give you a lot of good insight into what's happening. So I already have this deployed. So I'm going to go into my dashboard. And this also gives me just a lot of good, interesting information about my app in general and the service. So I get an idea of the type of traffic that's coming in, if there's any error codes that's happening, information about the container, the nodes, all that type of stuff. So, very good, very interesting information. Last thing I want to highlight is Greg mentioned when we install KF, part of the installation is to install the Anthos service mesh. And so we have done that. And so by doing that, any app that you deploy through KF is also been put into the mesh. And along with that, on top of the things that you can do with KF, the service mesh provides you other ways of doing security and doing traffic routing and a whole bunch of other features automatically. So I'm going to take a look at that real quick. So in my Anthos tab, I can go to service mesh. And I only have the service mesh. I just have a couple services in here, so there's not too much to show. But I'll show the topology. So this is nice. What's deployed initially is the Istio ingress gateway. So that's the gateway that sits in the cluster that's going to receive the traffic when I open up that URL. And once the ingress gateway receives that traffic based on the domain name or the base path, it'll route that request to the pod that should be serving it up. So in this case, it's the Spring Music pod that's delivering my app. I go back to table view and go into Spring Music. So this is like an overview page that gives me a lot of information on here. If I go into traffic, it'll just show me some traffic details about what type of traffic is coming into my service. If I go to connected services, this is good because it gives you an idea of all the different services that are deployed in the mesh and how they're connected to each other. So in this case, I don't have much. I just have my Ingress gateway, which is by default, and then my Spring Music. If I had other services that my Spring service called, then you would also see that as well. So this gives you an idea of what's happening inbound and also outbound. The metrics are nice because that just gives me more information on what's happening with my app, with the service, errors, latency, things like that. So it's all very good for an administrator to take a look at. Last thing I'll show is health. So what this does is gives me an opportunity to create what's called an SLO. And I, as an operator, I may have certain expectations of how I want my app and my service to perform. So, and it could be it's supposed to be within a certain set of range for latency or response time, things like that. So I can create an SLO, which is an expectation of how it should perform. And if it doesn't meet the SLO, then I'll get alerted so I can take a look at it and see what's happening. So in this case, I'll create an SLO, and this one I'm going to base on latency. So I'm going to have choose latency. I'm going to just pick something just so it shows that it can be triggered. This probably wouldn't be a practical example, but I'll just put one. So in this case, I'm expecting it to be 5 milliseconds response time. And I'm going to say 85%. So I expect 85% of the time it's going to respond within 5 milliseconds. And I'm going to measure this over the course of a day. So I'll hit continue. And then this is the JSON configuration if I wanted to automate the creation of this. So this creates the SLO. You can already tell that it's within the air budget, which means it's already based on previous traffic patterns already probably will get triggered. Now I'm going to create an alert in case this happens, and I'm going to just change this to be very short. So I'm going to change this to look back within the last 5 minutes and then with no threshold. If this does get triggered, I have my email already set up as a notification. There's plenty of other notifications that could be configured. This one, I just have an email. And you can also set a message to the person who gets this message. So as you can see, this one's already out of budget, and it gives me some more examples. If I go to, just go back to the overview page into my service mesh, this will, if it's within range, it's going to show it. If it's been alerted, also give a red box as well. And so I could go into this, and it gives me the warnings about what's happening. And in the health, I can take a look at what's happening. So there's actually, so that was just a real quick example of how to set an SLO in the service mesh. At sre.google, we have a whole bunch of information about site reliability engineering, and we have a specific program on the art of the SLOs. Great workshop material. There's some handbooks and different things that you and your team can go through, and it walks you through how to create a good SLO for your organization and how to use that. So that's something you're interested in. Highly recommend that workshop to get more information about how to set a good SLO for your apps. So that's about it for the demo. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Greg.
So KF and this whole process of migrating, do you sort of see this as long-term end state, or do you think it's more of a kind of a step along the way?
Yeah. So I personally view it as a bridge that customers can use to get to Kubernetes. Kubernetes is so full-featured, and it's the trend that so many organizations are adopting. A KF tool provides a good way or easy way of interfacing it, especially with the way that you may be comfortable with already. So it's a great way to interface with it and start your migration and start doing those things right away. But I see as developers get more comfortable with kubectl, they may prefer kubectl in the future, or even some of the administrators and operators. So KF will still be there to do the things that it needs to do. But I think as the the developers or operators try to do additional things that KF may not have a command for, they'll start learning the kubectl commands and start engaging with the cluster in different ways and in more advanced ways over time.
That makes sense. And in fact, I think our next slide talks a little bit about some of the different migration paths. And I don't want to spend much time on this slide, but basically, we talked today about that lower path, which is probably the easiest path of migrating KF, migrating Cloud Foundry directly using KF. There are cases where maybe you want to start using a serverless technology like Cloud Run. Maybe you want to run that on-prem. Maybe eventually you want to have that completely managed for you inside of GCP. In my experience, right, with any migration, whether it's a Cloud Foundry migration or anything else, there's not going to be a straight path, right? Even here, it's got straight lines. Usually, it's more like a squiggly line, and you do different things at different times for different apps. And I'm sure for those of us that have been through this, that makes some sense.
Yeah.
So if you can go to the next slide, David. So if any of this sounds good, if you want to try it yourself, we mentioned that quick start guide. There's the link to the quick start guide. It's in the documentation. The QR goes right to the same place as well. There's also some email addresses. So the quick start guide is a great way to give it a try. Try it out, see what's working. You don't have to take our word for it and see how this works. And then if there are more questions, if you're ready to kind of get started, you want to understand how this would fit in your enterprise, there are some email addresses. Feel free to ping any of us. We will try to answer your questions or certainly get you hooked up with the correct people. Now go ahead to the next slide. And then the last thing, I just want to plug the next session, the next application modernization session within the Google Cloud Innovators Program, which is going to be, we're going to have a couple of our product experts. They're going to talk about security posture with GKE using ACM, which is Anthos Config Manager, and ASM, which is Anthos Service Mesh. So that's going to be on the 17th. It should be a good session. So if you're interested in that, please join that session.